Hi guys, my name is Megan. I'm the teacher consultant here at Woodland Developmental Center, and I am so incredibly excited to introduce to you our 2025 March is Reading Month book for our One Book, One School. This year we're reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So we're going to dig in, but there's a lot of the characters around the back, Willy Wonka. We are so incredibly excited to kick this off, and if you read your chapters at home and return your reading log on the last day of the month, March 21st, we are going to get to chocolate cover our administration. So read. Each day here at school, we'll have comprehension questions to answer for prizes. There's different activities for you to do at home. But today we're going to read chapters 1 and 2. But I'm going to read to you chapter 1. Chapter 1. Here comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket. This is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. This whole family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and little Charlie Bucket live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. It's their little house right there. And here's the big town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and the little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon a mattress on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house, or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family who worked. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day on a bench and screwed little caps onto the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer has never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that such a large family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers and 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went around from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all. Although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for the growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get a taste of a bit of chocolate. The whole family would save up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat by himself. And each time he received it on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it as if it was a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then at last, when he couldn't stand it anymore, he would peel it back and expose one tiny corner of chocolate, and then he would take a nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day, he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on. And in this way, Charlie would make his 10-cent bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't told you yet about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing any slabs of chocolate in shop windows or watching other children munching creamy candy bars right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you can imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house where Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary, enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest, most famous in the world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates there ever has been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading up to it and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile in every direction, the air was scented with the rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the factory gates. And every time he went by, he would walk very, very slowly. And he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, how he loved that smell. And oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. That's the end of chapter 1.
Hi, this is Jill Pertucci in room 206, and I will be reading chapter 2, Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door open and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandma Georgeline," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin, for they loved this little boy, and he was the only bright thing in his lives, and this evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True," cried 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." "Clever?" cried the old man. "He was more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Willy Wonka and his factory? Never, answered little Charlie. Good heavens above! I don't know what's the matter with me. Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please? I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully. Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anyone can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka, cried Grandpa Joe. Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make? Perfectly true, cried Grandma Jocelyn. And he sends them to all the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe? It is, dear, it is. And to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice creams so it stays cold for hours and